Hello and welcome back to Interpreting India. The beginning of 2021 has been defined by a deadly second wave of the pandemic, precarious geopolitical relations, and a rapidly evolving technological landscape. This season, we at Carnegie India are examining many of the challenges and opportunities that India will confront in the coming decade. I'm your host Shibani Mehta, and this week we're diving deep into China's economic aid to South Asia. China's meteoric economic rise has resulted in a massive expansion of its international economic aid and development programs. Under the Belt and Road Initiative, analysts predict that China could spend close to $1.2 trillion on global development projects, ranging from building cyber infrastructure to large scale connectivity projects. These programs have placed China as an attractive alternative to the established players in the global development space. However, China's growing role in global economic development has also resulted in increased scrutiny. According to some analysts, Chinese development aid is often unsustainable for the host country, creating onerous debt obligations while making only marginal contributions to local employment. In this episode of Interpreting India, we analyze China's economic and development aid in South Asia. How has China's profile as a key economic partner developed in the South Asian region? What impact has China's economic aid had on its political influence in the region? And finally, how should India respond to China's clout in South Asia? Joining us today to discuss this is Deep Pal. Deep Pal is a visiting scholar in the Asia program at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is also a non-resident fellow at the National Bureau of Asian Research. Before this, he worked with NBR, the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C., and at the Institute of International Relations in Taipei. He also has a decade's experience as a broadcast journalist for some of the most watched television stations in India. Deep has recently authored the paper China's Influence in South Asia, Vulnerabilities and Resilience in Four Countries. Hi Deep, welcome to the other side of the mic on Interpreting India. We're very excited to have you join us for this episode and talk to us about China's engagement in the region of South Asia.
Thank you, Shivani. It's indeed a pleasure and interesting to be, as you said, on the other side of the mic.
So let's dive right into it. So Deep, the first thing that I wanted to ask you is about the Chinese model of economic aid when compared to what are called the more traditional, say, the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. What are some of the characteristics that make China an attractive donor for South Asian countries like Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bangladesh, or even the Maldives?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because what we see when it comes to Chinese assistance is that it does not follow the same cookie cutter kind of model that more traditional assistance giving organizations or countries do, right? And what do I mean by that? So, for example, one of the key aspects in which the aid or the assistance differs in case of China is that there is no domestic governance related provision, right? When it comes to ADB or when it comes to any of the other agencies, one of the things that they say is that, democratization norms are looked at. They look at anti-corruption issues and things like that. For example, there have been projects in Bangladesh which the World Bank dropped out of because of corruption concerns, right? So in case of China, one of the first things we see is that China says that these are all issues that are internal to a country and therefore they don't really care about them, right? How a country deals with democratization, corruption, and so on and so forth is something that the country has to figure out. That does not interfere with the decision by Chinese entities to whether or not fund projects or give loans to these countries. So that's one of the major things. And if you look at all of these countries, these are all countries where institution building is still a continuous process, right? So there are these issues that all of them grapple with, In all fairness, they try to fix many of the things. Some of the things work immediately. Some of the things are longer term. China's decision to fund them or not fund them is not based on these structural issues. So that's a very key aspect. That is something that these countries like. The other aspect is one of the things that we noticed while we were working on this project is that Chinese stakeholders, whether they are whether it's the embassy, whether it's Chinese companies, whether state-owned companies or other companies that are working in these countries, Chinese journalists, and so on and so forth, they work in tandem. So when a country needs something, if one of the Chinese stakeholders come to know about it, they pass it on, and the conversation begins from there, right? So we heard a stakeholder in one of these countries talk about how they had talked about some tourism related work that they wanted done, some tourism related assistance that they were looking for. And to this person's surprise, in a couple of days, someone from the Chinese embassy reached out with options saying that, we heard that you were looking for something like this. We have these options. We have these people that you might want to talk with and see where it goes, right? In many of the cases, Chinese assistance comes to these people, right? Instead of them having to go looking for money, looking for assistance, looking for how this works out. Another interesting aspect is, and this is again something that we heard from a number of stakeholders in multiple countries, is that in cases where the countries feel that they don't have the bandwidth to understand or manage these complicated financial instruments, China very often comes and says, Chinese entities, very often they come and say that, okay, once you agree, we will take care of the back end. We will help you figure out how to do the back end, and you can start your work within, let's say, 6 months. Speed, another very interesting aspect that these countries talk about, right? Where when you go to a World Bank or an ADB, various boxes have to be checked. It's a long drawn process. Someone we spoke with said that, if I want to work with a Chinese company, from the time I speak to them first to the time when the project gets off ground, 6 months would have elapsed, right? So all of these factors are important. Another important factor that I really want to emphasize here, Shivani, is the fact that not all of these decisions are taken only from the governance related approach. There is a strong political purpose as well. What do I mean by that? Essentially, in many cases, let's say a government has gotten elected in one of these countries. Chinese entities approach them and say that, one of the, and we all know that for all of these countries, infrastructure projects are very important, right? It is top in their list of priorities. So a Chinese entity or someone from the Chinese embassy or from a Chinese company would approach someone in the government and say that, we know that you really need this bridge or this highway or this airport or some other infrastructure project. Why don't you help us? Why don't you let us help you with it? And we are going to make sure that this is ready before the next elections. Now, from a political point of view, this is a very attractive proposition for almost all political parties, for almost all political entities in South Asia. Essentially, what this Chinese proposal means is that by the time this political party is up for election again, they will already have a major project that they can showcase. They can point at it and say that, this bridge, it got made in the last 3 years or 4 years, and here it is, right? That gives them an immediate advantage over other domestic political actors. So these are some of the reasons why this form of development assistance has become so attractive to these countries.
I'll pick up on one of the last reasons that you mentioned, which was infrastructure projects and how they serve a political purpose for the country that is receiving the sort of aid and any kind of assistance from China. That was very highly debated amongst the scholars and experts around the world. And a common narrative that surrounds the Chinese development aid is how that impacts the local state's autonomy. And first, if I take the Sri Lanka example forward, there was a lot of criticism of China in Sri Lanka would mean that the local sort of institutions would have to surrender their power, or by agreeing to the conditions that China was laying, it wouldn't have agency. I think, to what extent has the debt trap issue played out in China's economic outreach to South Asia?
the way I would look at this question is that there are multiple aspects to this. One is that I think the debt trap perspective, or the debt trap angle in the discourse is not really the entire story, and I'll explain in a minute why. Before I get to that, of course, you mentioned the entire port city bill, the developments in Sri Lanka, and yes, there are questions of sovereignty. There are questions of what China expects, in exchange for all the assistance that they render to these countries, and that is something that we have seen during the project. I mean, China has become more and more careful about, or insistent on controlling the narrative about how they are presented in the country, right? We have seen various ways in which China has reached out to the media or various actors in the civil society about how they are talked about, right? And either try to coax them, cajole them, even push them, right? Use maybe friendly arms of the government in that particular country, and tell these and try to pressure these agencies into writing or talking well about them, right? So there is that concern. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, this narrative of debt traps, right? Being any Chinese money, the moment it comes, it is basically trapping the country into this net of debt that they won't be able to get out of. I think the problem with this narrative is that it's oversimplified, and it does not talk about the agency that these countries have. Right. When you look at any of these countries, they have a great deal of say in who they want to partner with, right? And if they are partnering with China today for development projects or for anything else, that there is a very strong instrumentalist reason for it. It basically means that they have looked at various options, and this is the option that China is offering them seems to be the one that is working the best for them, right? I mean, when we talk about the United States or its partners and allies, or we talk about India, which is a big presence in the region, obviously. Why are these countries not going with these countries and going with China? That is not an ideological decision. That is guided by the fact that these countries are looking at the options presented in front of them and finding that the Chinese option is the one that works for them the best right now. Now, that may be a purely governance related decision, that may be a political decision, that may have various reasons why they feel that way. But it is essentially a decision that is guided by what they think is best for them at the moment. Now, that's one. The second point is, when people talk about the debt trap, what they don't consider is that in many cases, we have seen these countries go for options of financing that are not necessarily Chinese. For example, if you look at these countries, you'll find that Bangladesh prefers soft loans over commercial loans. We have seen a deep sea port project in Bangladesh that was being made with Chinese assistance, with Chinese money, being cancelled because Bangladesh found Japan agreeing to make another deep sea port very close to this earlier proposed project for a far lower cost. They were getting a soft loan. They were getting it for 30 years or so. And financially, it made so much more sense. So they chose to shift to this. If you look at Nepal, in fact, prefers grants over soft loans. So these countries are all extremely careful to go for options where the money is cheaper. Now, are there not instances where they still go for Chinese loans where it's more expensive? Yes, they do. And there may be internal structural corruption related or various other reasons that lead them to do that. It would, however, be wrong to try and paint the entire region in that one brush where everyone's falling under a debt trap. Now we can come to Sri Lanka, right, where this entire conversation about debt trap is the most severe. Now Sri Lanka right now, and this is a study from I think last year, which found that about 6% or so of Sri Lanka's external debt is actually held by Chinese, right, by Chinese entities. Now Sri Lanka is not in a position where they are in a debt trap right now. But at the same time, Sri Lanka's economy needs a lot of help right now. And there are very few entities, very few countries around the world that would agree to fund Sri Lanka right now. The Chinese, however, are okay with doing it. And that is where the concern of debt trap comes in. If it continues like this, then yes, there is a possibility that eventually there will be a debt trap for Sri Lanka related to Chinese money. If other entities across the world, other countries, they agree to fund Sri Lanka's economy and assistance needs, then that may not be the case. I think that's an important distinction that one needs to remember.
That is a very important conversation to have because, like you mentioned, it's not like countries in South Asia are just looking at China. We do know that Sri Lanka is employing multiple means to kind of boost its economy, which are not all dependent on China. They're looking at currency swaps. Sri Lanka has reached out to other financial institutions for aid and sort of financial assistance. So yeah, I think that is an important point to make. I just want to move back to something that you mentioned earlier, which was about when we were talking about why Chinese aid is attractive, where you said China's model is to kind of respond to the needs of the South Asian country and to, I think you used the term cookie cutter model, where they're listening to what the South Asian country is asking for and sort of changing the package, if I may, of aid according to needs. And there are no sort of no strings are attached to this. But is it right to say that there isn't a sort of political influence that this creates? How does assistance from Beijing politically influence these countries in South Asia? And I think the second question that comes from this is, how does the Chinese political influence mean for other powers that have interests in the region?
Absolutely. I mean, Shivani, so one of the things that we do say in this report is that China's primary levers are at the moment economic, right? But at the same time, their primary interest in the region is strategic, right? And basically what that means is that because, as I have mentioned before, for most of these countries, their list of priorities includes a lot of connectivity or infrastructure projects, right? So that is usually, and that is an area in which China is in a good position to try and help them, right? So that is primarily why they start entering these countries, or they start engaging with these countries from the infrastructure assistance development perspective. But at the same time, and this is something, again, I keep going back to the report because this is something that we focused on a great deal. If you look at the way the relationship has changed in the last 8-10 years, right, there has been way more political engagement between the two sides. I mean, look at Nepal. Is that the Chinese Communist Party and its various arms have been reaching out to political parties in all of these countries. Okay, they have been holding joint study sessions with them. They have been holding conferences with them. They have been talking to them for various things, and it especially helps we see this have seen this in particularly two countries. One of them is Nepal, where there is ideological affinity, or there was ideological affinity as well, as long as the Communist Party was in power till earlier in 2021, right? So for the Communist Party of in China and for the Communist Party in Nepal, there were a lot of things that they felt they could engage on or talk with. Another place where you see this quite often is Sri Lanka, where a vast number of political parties have come together and engaged with the Chinese Communist Party. Now, that is the political side of things. Another aspect in which we have seen China engage far more is the people-to-people aspect, where Chinese companies that are present in these countries, or Chinese entities that are present in these countries, they are helping build infrastructure in, let's say, schools in the areas that they are operating out of, right? They are donating infrastructure, or they're donating books and various other kind of material that an organization might need. They're tying up with universities, not just for the study of the language, of the Chinese language, but also for the study of China or China and this particular country's relations, right? We are seeing engagements that take the form of fellowships and financial awards of various kinds, which are directed towards students in some cases, but also towards research professionals or towards journalists, right? Basically offering them an opportunity to go to China for a year or at times more and to know more about the country, right? So this is something that we have seen happen over the last few years, where the attempt is to have a whole of society approach in their engagement with these various countries, with Sri Lanka, with Nepal, with Bangladesh, with the Maldives, and that is also necessitated by the fact that in some of these countries, for example, when you look at Nepal, right? Nepal has had a very long-standing trade-based, family relationships-based connection with Tibet already, right? So they have not been unfamiliar with China. But if you look at the Maldives, China is a far more recent entrant, right? They obviously have known about China, but interactions have been limited for the longest time. So when these kind of pushes come that help address the relationship from all aspects of society, it really has helped China be at the front and center of the minds of the people and of governments, of institutions in these various countries. I'm sorry, I've forgotten. What was the other question you asked?
My second question was, what does increased engagement from Beijing in the region mean for other powers? So, say India and the United States, how does it impact their influence in the region?
I think what it means for other powers in the region is that they will have to try extra hard to keep the countries in the region engaged, right? Because all of these countries now, we are far more connected now globally than we were even 10 years or 15 years or 20 years ago, right? So anyone sitting in the farthest corners of the Maldives or Sri Lanka or Nepal or wherever, right? If they have an internet connection, if they have a smartphone, they can find out about what is happening in the world, how people in various parts of the world live, what are the options and opportunities that are available to them. Now, this is something that they want for themselves. This is something that they ask for from their governments, right? And for the governments then to give their citizens the kind of opportunities that are available globally, they turn to various partners, which basically means that they would essentially have to try extra hard. I talked about earlier how Chinese companies or Chinese entities, they come to these countries and say, if you need a bridge, why don't we help you with it, right? So they are far more proactive, right? So this proactiveness is something that various countries or various agencies, whoever wants to stay engaged with these countries, they will have to show. One of the questions that stakeholders across the region, when we were speaking with them, raised repeatedly, that what is, let's say, the US's long-term plan in South Asia, right? What is US's South Asia policy, right? Essentially, what this means is that there will have to be a clear, consistent, long-term policy that will have to be in the play for these countries to look at the various countries. The same stakeholders who asked, what is US's long-term policy in South Asia, they also pointed at China and said, look at China in Sri Lanka. There was a lot of controversy over the Hambantota project. There was a lot of controversy over the Port City project, but China did not leave. They kept their head down. They waited it out. They continued with their work, and they worked towards the completion of the projects as they had promised to these countries. Of course, the entire aspect of whether these are viable projects or not viable projects is a valid question, and that needs to be discussed as well. But at the same time, they were the impression that the Chinese entities, Chinese companies, Chinese players in these countries give when they stay on throughout controversy and questioning is that they are consistent and reliable partners who are here for the longer term. Now, for India, for others, the question of consistency is going to be primary. What can these countries, what can these powers, India, US, or anyone else, what can they do for these countries consistently, reliably, and for the longer term? That is what these countries are essentially asking.
When you spoke about China's whole of society approach, you used two specific examples. One was a shared political ideology between Nepal and China, which I think has played out in a lot of ways. But one that comes to my mind is training Nepali politicians in Xi Jinping thought that the Chinese Communist Party conducted as a workshop. And you also spoke about the cultural ties and how the whole of society approach that China follows is quite different from what other donors would follow, which is tied to a specific infrastructure project or a development program. I want to know if through your research you have found that the countries in the region that are receiving Chinese assistance are there any common characteristics or even say strengths and weaknesses that these countries have, which China is able to tap into?
Yeah, Shivani. So that's a really interesting question, and one of the things that faced us when we were looking at these four countries is how does one draw parallels between them, right? Because we are trying to understand Chinese presence in the region, and at least thematically, one does need to have some kind of parallels, some ways of measuring, right? How these countries, these very different countries, are faring, right? I mean, and one of the first things that we saw was similar was that all of these countries, they need infrastructure projects, right? They need connectivity projects. They need highways, airports, ports, power plants, and so on and so forth. But beyond that, they're all very different countries. I mean, countries like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh are regional, are countries that are climbing out of their LDC status, right? On the other hand, Maldives is a much smaller country which is an island, which has climate change related concerns, where the focus areas are quite different. Now, which is why one of the ways in which we try to understand the impact of Chinese engagement in the region was through what we call the vulnerabilities framework, right? And what do we mean by that? We look at three particular dimensions. One is how are the state institutions doing in the face of increased Chinese engagement. Another is how are civil society components, organizations and individuals doing, and the third is what role do the elites play? Are these elites capturable, or are they already captured, right? So these are three particular dimensions or variables, right, that we tried to analyze in looking at these countries. And the reason why this helps is if you think of them, there are indicators as parts of these three variables that are common across the countries, right? So let's say corruption or electoral practices or strength of the constitution, or things like how easy or difficult is it for civil society organizations to operate in these countries? What kind of pressures do they face? Legally, how protected are they? Or when you look at elites, whether they are capturable or captured or not, what are the various kind of checks and balances that exist to ensure that political or business elites, they are not influenced or influenceable, right? And that is something that really made a lot of difference. And what we could do was also form a kind of a scale through which we could look at these four countries, where they appear in terms of their relative strengths or weaknesses when it comes to institutions or civil societies, or their elites. Now, what this also does is it gives us an idea of which direction these countries might go. For example, one of the things that we found with Bangladesh was that their state institutions, while they are not the weakest. There have been questions about their electoral practices. Right now, they are up for elections in a couple of years. If the elections are considered free and fair, then we would possibly see the institutions being strengthened, which will allow less leeway for a player like China, which may want to move in and influence state institutions, less space to be able to do so. Similarly, in Sri Lanka, we found that the capturability of the elites was the biggest concern in Sri Lanka in comparison to all of these countries. And the reason for that, we know, is the Rajapaksas have been working with China in ways that have been concerning since their previous tenure. Right now, if in a future election we see the Rajapaksas being replaced by someone, and there being a dialing down of the ways in which China manages to capture the elites, then that again becomes less of a concern. So we found that these are very useful tools. This framework is a very useful tool when you look at it from these three particular perspectives: institutions, freedom of civil societies to operate, as well as the impact of Chinese influence on elites, whether they are being captured or are they capturable in some way or the other.
It is a very unique way of understanding the levers that China is using in the region, and the scope of impact that each of them has in these countries. So just to continue with this, you had mentioned earlier that these states that are receiving financial assistance from China are operating out of self-interest. It is not that they're taking whatever is being offered to them. They have certain demands that they do place. And I think the example you mentioned was about Bangladesh choosing Japan over China for a particular project. Did you find that countries in South Asia were also learning from each other in terms of how to put their demands to China, and in certain cases maybe be able to push back as well? Or does everyone just accept whatever's being offered because China is a big power, it's intimidating, and as a small state, you're happy to get what you're given?
Oh, absolutely not. I mean, all of these countries, as I have said time and again, we tend to underestimate the kind of agency, right, that these countries clearly have and demonstrate as having. For example, the Bangladeshi someone in the Bangladeshi government did talk about how they are looking at, and they were asked this question by an Indian journalist and about Chinese debt trap and so on, and they said that don't think that we are not looking at other countries, don't think that we are not looking at what is happening in Djibouti or what is happening in other parts of the world or other parts of the region to understand how Chinese influence works. And that is largely something that most stakeholders that I have spoken with, they tend to repeat, that we may not have, government to government conversations about how to work with China or how to deal with China, right? But that does not mean that we are not looking at what China is doing in the region and how it is working out for the countries. The Sri Lanka example keeps coming up every once in a while, right? Where there are instances of unviable projects, right? And that is something that all of these countries have definitely learned from each other, and they're very careful to look at these projects and and ask themselves, is this something that is going to be viable for us? So that's one of the things that we have seen them learn from each other. We have seen Maldives and Sri Lanka unofficially having a conversation about the loans that the Chinese loans that they have taken, which in a post-COVID situation are difficult to repay following the earlier schedules. There have been conversations unofficially in various amongst various stakeholders in these countries about whether they can ask for some kind of a restructuring from China, which they have already done or will do. But whether or not these countries learn from each other in terms of how they think they can operate in this region, how they think they can work with China, and essentially the purpose of them engaging with each other has to do with figuring out how to get a better deal, how to get a better bargaining hand, both for themselves individually and as a collective.
So there are being lessons learned by watching each other and seeing how other countries in the region navigate China's engagement. And but I'd like to go back to a point that you were making earlier about other powers with an interest in the region, namely the United States and India, where you said one thing that can be done would be to be as consistent as China is in terms of its engagement. Because we are about interpreting India, my last question to you is, how does Beijing's growing footprint in the region influence, or rather impact, New Delhi's position? And would you say that India is adapting to this new reality where it is no longer the economic and political power in the neighborhood?
Mm-hmm. So I think, Shivani, the way to look at it is by acknowledging that no country, right, in this changed, globalized world, and where we are talking about the post Cold War era emerging, right? No country is what it used to be, right? I think for New Delhi, there are a number of things that are being done, but also need to be done, right? And that is true not just for New Delhi, that is true for the US, for anyone, any country that is interested in the region. The way that we have been, the kind of relationship that we have had with these countries, they will continue to exist in some ways. The historical, the cultural relationships that we have had with them, that is irreplaceable, right? I mean, many of my conversations with these stakeholders has started by talking about, as much of a cliche as this is, has started by talking about either cricket or about Indian movies. That is just how it is. But at the same time, something that is interesting to note is that, from most of these countries that we are talking about, influx of students, right, used to primarily be to India, right? Higher education was primarily about studying in India. That is no longer the case. A lot of students are going to China, and that is guided by better financial aid, financial assistance available from the Chinese government. And many of them are not even going to China. They are going beyond. They are going to Australia. They're going to Singapore and various other countries. So that is something that has to be understood and remembered. Now, in this changed situation, how does New Delhi stay relevant? I think New Delhi has still a lot to offer in terms of helping these countries build their capacity, right? In terms of assisting them in connectivity projects. Now, what these countries are asking for today is basically India engaging them as equal partners. When we talk about having familial relations with these countries, and this is again something a stakeholder mentioned to me, that in a family you always have an elder brother and a younger brother. You want to be looked at and talked to as equal partners, right? And that is something that is of a great deal of significance. Another way in which New Delhi can remain and is remaining significant, relevant in the region is by ironically doing what China does. As I mentioned, China comes in, looks at the country and sees what they need, and then starts the conversation from there. So for New Delhi, there has to be an approach that prioritizes what these countries need. So essentially, not necessarily look at what China is doing, but basically talk to these countries and say, okay, what is it that you need? Essentially dehyphenate Indian engagement with these countries from Chinese, or for that matter, anyone else's presence. Instead, prioritizing what these particular countries need to be there. So these are some of the ways in which India can continue to be relevant. I just want to end with this one aspect that we tend to look at every small or big development in these countries from the Indian lens, that what this means for India. It would help us as students of international relations if we looked at them and acknowledged that not everything has to do with India or has to do with an external player. In many cases, these countries are just trying to achieve their own aspirations and choosing the best available route to them. If we can provide those routes, if India can provide those routes, then I don't see why any of these countries would not want to choose that.
Thank you so much, Deep. This has been an enlightening conversation. I think I take away 2 points from what your report has concluded, which is the vulnerabilities framework is an important tool to understand the region, and I think it helps us overcome this oversimplification of the entire region that we so often tend to do. And the second being that instead of focusing on India-China rivalry or US-China rivalry in the region, let's talk about the states that make up the region and what they need and how they go about achieving their aspirations. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Shivan. It's been a pleasure.
We'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. To make sure you don't miss it, be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about our research and team, you can visit us at carnegieindia.org. You can also find us on social media on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Thank you for listening. See you next time.